probably heard of Hapley, not W.T. Hapley, the son. No, I mean the celebrated Hapley, the Hapley of Periplaneta Hapleia, Hapley the entomologist. I mean, you've probably also heard of the great feud between Hapley and Professor Pawkins, although certain of its consequences may well be new to you. But for those of you who've heard of neither, I think a word or two of explanation is probably necessary. Your common man, you see, rarely has any conception of the zeal that animates a scientific investigator and the fury that can be stirred in him if he's contradicted. You know, it's the odium theologicum of our times. There are men, for instance, who would gladly see Professor Troubinet burnt at the stake for his treatment of mollusks in the Encyclopedia. That fantastic and daring extension of the cephalopods to cover the pteropods. But sorry, I'm wandering from Hapley and Pawkins. The mutual hatred that existed between these two men began years and years ago with a revision of the Microlepidoptera by Pawkins, in which he extinguished a new species that had been created by Hapley. Now, Hapley, who never backed down from a fight, replied with a stinging impeachment of Pawkins' entire classification system in a review for the Journal of the Entomological Society. Pawkins, in his rejoinder in the following issue, suggested that Hapley's microscope was as defective as his powers of observation and called him an irresponsible meddler. And then Hapley, in a letter to the Times, spoke frankly of Pawkins' revision as a miracle of ineptitude. It was war to the knife. Now, I'm not going to go into every detail of the ways in which these two great men quarrelled, or exactly how the splits between them widened until, from the Microlepidoptera, they were at war upon almost every open question in entomology. It was a long struggle with many memorable skirmishes, vicious from the beginning and growing at last to pitiless antagonism. I mean, on the whole, if you ask me, I would have to say that I think Pawkins was closer to the truth than Hapley. But you see, Hapley was the more skilled rhetorician. You know, he had a turn of ridicule rare in a scientific man, while Pawkins was prosy of speech, dull of presence, and shaped like a water barrel. You know, he lacked charisma, and so the younger, more vocal men in the society tended to gather around Hapley. Things came to a head in 1891, when Pawkins, who was then in ill health, published a paper upon the mesoblast of the death's head moth. Now, what the mesoblast of the death's head moth is or was does not matter a rap to this story. What is important is that this work was far below Pawkins' usual standard, and it gave Hapley the opening that he had coveted for years. I mean, he must have been working day and night to make the most of this advantage. And in an elaborate public critique before a packed lecture theatre at the Institute, he rent Professor Pawkins to tatters. Now, I myself was unfortunately absent from that meeting myself, but you can easily imagine that the man's disordered black hair and sneering mouth and his queer dark eyes flashing around the audience as he rounded on his old foe. Pawkins' reply, by contrast, apparently was halting and ineffectual. I mean, there was no mistaking his will to wound Hapley, but he was quite unable to make his mark. And having got his opponent down, Hapley fully intended to finish him off. He followed his speech with a brutal written attack in the form of a paper upon the development of moths in general, a paper showing evidence of a most extraordinary amount of mental labour, and one couched in a violently controversial tone. You know, it must have covered Pawkins with shame and confusion when he read it. He was murderous in argument, utterly contemptuous in tone. It left no loophole. I mean, it was an awful thing, really, for a man in the declining years of his career to be faced with. Now, the world of entomology waited breathlessly for the rejoinder from Pawkins, but when it came, it surprised us all. For the rejoinder of Pawkins was to catch influenza, proceed to pneumonia, and die. I mean, it was perhaps as effectual a reply as he could make under the circumstances, and it largely turned the current of feeling against Hapley. I mean, the very people who had most gleefully cheered on these gladiators became suddenly very serious at the consequences of the combat. Or, I mean, there could be no reasonable doubt that the humiliation he had suffered at Hapley's hands had contributed to the death of Professor Pawkins. I mean, another crushing attack was unfortunately already in the press, and it appeared on the day before the funeral. I mean, I don't think Hapley exerted himself to stop it, but, well, scathing satire reads ill over fresh mould. You know, people forgot how Hapley had hounded down his rival, and they forgot that rival's defects. Opinions were expressed in the daily papers. It was that, in fact, that made me think that perhaps you may have heard of Hapley in the first place. Now, in his private thoughts, Hapley could not forgive Pawkins for dying like that. In the first place, it was a mean dodge to escape the absolute pulverization that he had in hand for him. And in the second, it left Hapley's mind with a queer gap in it. I mean, for over 20 years, he'd worked tirelessly, sometimes far into the night, 7 days a week, with microscope, scalpel, collecting net and pen, and almost entirely with reference to Pawkins. I mean, the European reputation that he'd won had come as a mere incident in that great antipathy. He'd gradually worked up to a climax in this last controversy. It had killed Pawkins, but you see, it had also thrown Hapley out of gear, so to speak. And his doctor advised him to give up work for a time and go for a rest in the country. So Hapley went down to a quiet village in Kent, and he thought day and night about Pawkins and all the scathing things it was now impossible to say about him. At last, he began to realize in what direction the preoccupation tended, and he determined to fight against it. He tried to distract himself by reading novels and poetry, but he just couldn't get his mind off Pawkins. You know, his fat body and his pallid face making that last pathetic speech of his at the Institute, every sentence the most perfect opening for Hapley. He turned to chess, which worked for a while. He soon mastered the moves and the chief gambits and commoner closing positions, and he began to beat the vicar. But then you see the cylindrical contours of the opposing king began to resemble Pawkins, standing up and gasping ineffectually against the inevitable checkmate, and Hapley decided to give up chess too. He thought then perhaps that the study of some new branch of science would offer a diversion. I mean, that the best rest is change of occupation, he told himself. So he determined to plunge at diatoms, and he had one of his smaller microscopes sent down from London. You know, he thought that perhaps if he could stir up a vigorous quarrel with Professor Halibut, he might be able to begin life afresh and forget about Pawkins. And very soon he was hard at work at these microscopic denizens of the wayside pool. It was on the third day of his tackling the diatoms that Hapley became aware of a novel addition to the local fauna. He was working late at the microscope, and the only light in the room was a little lamp with a green glass shade. Now, like all experienced microscopists, Hapley kept both eyes open. It was the only way to avoid excessive fatigue. One eye was over the instrument, and it was bright and distinct before it was the circular field of the microscope, across which a brown diatom was slowly moving. With the other eye, Hapley saw, as it were, without seeing. Yeah, I mean, he was dimly conscious of the brass side of the instrument, the illuminated part of the tablecloth, a sheet of notepaper, the foot of the lamp, and the darkened room beyond. But suddenly his attention drifted from one eye to the other. Now, the tablecloth was brightly coloured. It was gold, crimson, and pale blue upon a greyish ground. But at one point, the pattern seemed displaced, and there was a faint vibration of the colours. Well, Hapley moved his head back to look with both eyes, and his mouth fell open in astonishment, because resting there on the tablecloth, its wings spread in a butterfly fashion, was a very large moth. I mean, it was strange that it should be in the room at all with all the windows closed. Strange that it should not have attracted his attention when fluttering to its present position. Strange that it should match the tablecloth so closely. But stranger by far that to him, Hapley, the great entomologist, it was altogether unknown. I mean, there was no delusion. It was crawling slowly towards the foot of the lamp. A new genus, for heavens! And in England, muttered Hapley, staring. And then he suddenly thought of Porkins. In fact, something about the head and rather rounded body of the insect was rather suggestive of his old rival, just as the chess king had been. But, gah! Oh, nothing would have maddened Porkins more than a new discovery by Hapley, and the wretched man was dead. Well, confound Porkins, he said aloud. I must catch this thing. And looking around him for some means of catching the moth, Hapley slowly rose out of his chair. Suddenly, the insect rose too, struck the edge of the lampshade with a ping, and vanished into the shadow. In a moment, Hapley had whipped the lampshade off so that the whole room was illuminated. But the moth had disappeared. No! His practiced eye soon detected it on the wallpaper near the door. He went towards it, poising the lampshade for capture. Before he was within striking distance, however, it had risen and was fluttering around the room. After the fashion of its kind, it flew with sudden starts and turns, seeming to vanish here and reappear there. Once, Hapley struck and missed. And then again, the third time, he accidentally hit his microscope, which swayed, struck the lamp, and fell noisily upon the floor. The lamp turned over on the table and very luckily went out. Hapley was left in the dark, and with a start he felt the strange moth blunder into his face. God, it was maddening. There was no light to see by, and if he opened the door of the room, the thing would get away. He had a vision of Porkins laughing at him, and he swore furiously and stamped his foot on the floor. Just then there came a timid rapping at the door. It opened perhaps a foot, and the alarmed face of his landlady appeared behind a pink candle flame. She wore a nightcap over her grey hair and had some purple garment over her shoulders. What was that fearful smash, Mr. Hapley? Has anything— Shut that door, said Hapley, and suddenly rushed at her. The strange moth had appeared, fluttering about the chink of the door. The old lady emitted a small shriek, the door slammed, and Hapley was once more left in the dark. He heard her scuttle upstairs, lock her door, and drag something heavy across the room to put against it. Oh dear, he must have given her a fright, but well, he'd say sorry in the morning. But confound that moth, he couldn't lose it now. He felt his way into the hall and found the matches, and with a lighted candle, he returned to the sitting room. But there was no moth to be seen, although several times it seemed that it was fluttering around his head. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, Hapley decided reluctantly to give it up and go to bed. Oh, he was excited. All night his sleep was broken by dreams of the moth and his landlady and Professor Porkins. And twice in the night he got up to souse his head in cold water. Now, during breakfast, he spotted his landlady in her garden, and he thought that after last night's events, he'd better reassure her about his sanity. He went out and talked to her about beans and potatoes, caterpillars, and the price of fruit. She replied in her usual friendly manner, but she eyed him suspiciously, and she kept walking as they talked, making sure that there was always a flower bed or a row of beans between them. After a while, Hapley began to feel irritated by this, and to conceal his vexation, he went out for a walk, doing his best to keep his mind off the moth. But once he was sure that he saw it, with its wings flattened out upon the old stone wall that runs along the west edge of the park. Creeping up on it, however, he found that it was only 2 lumps of grey and yellow lichen. In the afternoon, he called upon the vicar and argued with him upon theological questions. They were sitting in the little arbour behind the rectory, smoking and wrangling, when suddenly Hapley shouted, "Look at that moth!" He was pointing to the edge of the wooden table. "Where?" said the vicar. "There! Don't you see a moth on the edge of the table there?" said Hapley. "No," said the vicar. "There!" The vicar looked at him oddly. He clearly saw nothing. Well, Hapley was rather abashed, and then he muttered, The eye of faith is clearly no better than the eye of science. I don't see your point, said the vicar, thinking that it was part of the argument. That night, Hapley found the moth crawling over his counterpane. But instead of trying to catch it this time, he sat on the edge of the bed and reasoned with himself. I mean, was it pure hallucination? Or was his mind beginning to give way? He battled for his sanity with the same silent energy he'd formerly displayed against Porkins. In fact, he felt as if in some sense this still was a struggle with Porkins. Now, he was well versed in psychology. He knew that such visual illusions are the result of mental strain. But the point was, he didn't only see the moth. He'd heard it too when it pinged against the edge of the lampshade, and afterwards when it hit the wall, and he'd felt it strike his own face and hair in the dark. And he looked at it very carefully now. It was perfectly clear and solid looking in the candlelight, not at all dreamlike. He saw the hairy body and the short feathery antennae, the jointed legs, even a place where the down was rubbed from the wing. He suddenly felt angry for himself for being so afraid of a little insect, and he muttered to himself long into the night. Now, his landlady had arranged for a maid to sleep in her room that night, and she'd locked it and bolted it and then put the chest of drawers against the door. The two women listened nervously for any unusual sounds from their guest's room, and they talked in whispers after they'd gone to bed, but nothing occurred to alarm them, and eventually they drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, they were abruptly woken by a commotion from Hapley's room. Slippered feet could be heard running to and fro, and then a chair was overturned. There was a violent dab at the wall, and then a china mantle ornament smashed upon the fender. Suddenly they heard Hapley run out onto the landing and stop outside their room. They clung to each other, trembling, but he seemed to be dancing on the staircase now. He'd go down 3 or 4 steps quickly and then come up again at a run. And then he hurried all the way down into the hall, and they heard the umbrella stand fall over and the fanlight break. Then the bolt shot and the chain rattled. He was opening the front door, so they hurried to the window. Now, it was a dim grey night. An almost unbroken sheet of watery cloud was sweeping across the moon, and the hedge and trees in front of the house were black against the pale roadway, but they saw Hapley, looking like a ghost in his shirt and white trousers, running to and fro on the road, beating the air with his flailing hands. Now he would stop and then dart very rapidly at something. Now he would move upon it with stealthy strides, and at last he ran out of sight up the road. Then, when they were arguing about who should go and lock the door, he returned, walking very fast. He came straight into the house, closed the door carefully, and went quietly up to his bedroom. And then everything was silent. "Mrs. Colville," said Hapley, calling down the staircase the next morning. I hope I didn't alarm you last night." "You may well ask that, Mr. Hapley," said Mrs. Colville. No, Professor. I'm Professor Hapley now. Anyway, no, the fact is, you see, that I'm afraid I'm a sleepwalker. Yeah, and the last 2 nights I've been without my usual mixture. There's nothing to be alarmed about. I'm just sorry that I made an ass of myself. I'll walk over to Shoreham today and get some stuff to make me sleep more soundly. I ought to have done that yesterday. So he set off, but halfway across the down, the Moth came upon Hapley again. They were just by the chalk pits. He tried to ignore it at first. He tried to occupy his mind with chess problems, but it was no good. The thing kept fluttering into his face, so he struck at it with his hat in self-defense. It withdrew a moment, but then it flew at him again, right at his forehead this time. And now rage, the old professional rage, the rage that he'd so often felt against Professor Porkins, came down upon him. He flew at the eddying insect with all his limbs, flailing and striking and leaping and swearing, until suddenly he trod on nothing and fell headlong. There was a gap in his sensations. Then Hapley found himself sitting on a heap of flints in front of the opening of the chalk pits, with his leg twisted back painfully beneath him. The moth was still fluttering around his head. He was feebly trying to waft it away with his hand when he saw two men approaching him. One was the village doctor. Now, it occurred to Hapley, first of all, that this was very lucky, but then it came to in his mind with extraordinary vividness that no one else would ever be able to see the strange moth except himself, and that it behoved him to keep silent about it. Late that night in hospital, however, after his broken leg had been set, he was feverish and he forgot his self-restraint. He was lying flat on a bed, and despite himself, he began to run his eyes around the room to see if the moth was about, and he soon caught sight of it. In fact, it was resting very close to his hand by the nightlight on the green tablecloth. Its wings were quivering as though in mirth. With a sudden wave of anger, he smote at it with his fist, and the nurse woke up with a shriek. "What is it? That moth," he said. What moth? That moth! Hapley could see quite clearly the insect was now going around the cornice and darting across the room. And he could see equally clearly that the nurse saw nothing. But he must keep himself in hand. He knew that he was a lost man if he could not keep himself in hand. But as the night waned, this fever grew upon him, and the very dread that he had of seeing the moth made him see the moth, always crawling nearby, vibrating slightly. At about 5 a.m., just as the dawn was grey, it became intolerable, and he tried to get out of bed to finally catch it, although his leg was afire with pain. No, Professor Hapley, you're to stay in bed. Professor Hapley, please. The nurse struggled to get him back down and summoned help, and on account of this, they tied him to the bed with straps. At this, the moth grew bolder. Hapley felt it settle in his hair, and because he began striking his head violently with his fists, they tied his arms down also. And then the moth began crawling all over his face. And Hapley wept and screamed and begged them to take it off. Now, the doctor, had he possessed the wit, might perhaps have saved Hapley from his fate by entering into this delusion, by covering his face with a gauze as he prayed might be done. But the doctor was a blockhead. He was a just qualified general practitioner, quite ignorant of mental science. He simply said, "There is no moth." And until his leg was healed, Hapley was kept tied to this bed with this imaginary insect crawling over him. It never left him while he was awake, and it grew monstrous in his dreams. While he was awake, he longed to sleep, and from sleep he always awoke screaming. So now Hapley is spending the remainder of his days in a padded room, worried by a moth that no one else can see. The asylum doctor calls it a hallucination, and they sedate him when things get too much. But in his easier moods, when he can talk, Hapley insists that the moth is the ghost of Professor Pawkins, and consequently a unique specimen and well worth the trouble of catching. Thank you very much.